Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. This is your captain speaking, Debbie Buyaki. Welcome aboard. Today we'll be taking a flight over nature's view, kicking off from Nairobi, making a stop at different cities, and finally landing at a conclusion that I am not so sure now. But I hope you enjoyed this climate journey story, and seatbelts on, wheels up. So, cities and climate change. Ding ding. We'll start with the facts. Of course, this is how we do things here, as I hope you will get accustomed to. So, 60% of the world's population will live in urban areas by 2030. Remember the significance of 2030? So, this is mainly because 80% of the world's wealth is generated in the cities. And this is something so crazy. In my country, we have like everyone, including my mom and their generation, they grew up in the suburbs or the countryside, and they moved to Nairobi to find work, and they settled here. So it's a whole analogy on how people just move out from their original homesteads and come to the cities to look for work. And this is quite detrimental because now the cities are getting populated. But if I may just throw in another fact with my beautiful Kenya, that we adopted a new constitution in 2010 that has more or less taken back life into the different areas apart from the big cities, Nairobi, Kisumu, and Mombasa. It's called devolution. So most of the works are now being taken out of the cities. I hope this was the aim as well because it's clearly working. But anyway, that's just like a side note. But what's the relationship now between climate change and cities? Cities both contribute to and are affected the most by climate change. The world's cities are responsible for up to 70% of greenhouse gas emissions. This is just because, of the industries located there with the job opportunities that come with that. So they are the biggest producers of greenhouse gas emissions. And turns out now we end up suffering the most from our own actions in the cities. And out of all the big numbers that are in the statistics with cities, they only occupy 2% of the world's land surface. So cities are like the smallest, but they're the most detrimental when it comes to climate change. Interesting. So at the same time, the effects of climate change, such as rising sea levels and extreme weather events, do negatively affect the urban population, infrastructure, and ultimate economic growth. I will try to as much portray how all these are related. Climate change, population growth, economic growth and decline and stuff like that. Then finally, 70% of industrial wastes are dumped untreated into waters, polluting usable water supply. I think this is still the point on cities are the most detrimental to climate change, but in return, they are the ones who suffer the most in regards to climate change and their effects. By the way, we had a whole study, and this is an event I also attended, by a group called Kairos Futura, which I didn't plan to mention, but I'm just going to say that. They have a whole study on Nairobi city and in regards to the pollution that goes on. And there's one artist who had a project on the rivers. We have a river in Nairobi that flows in 3 tributaries. And so he went about collecting stuff in the rivers from different points and locations of the city. So we have like the green and leafy suburbs where the rich guys live. The water was so clear. It was really nice water as when it comes to, as the river flows into the informal settlements, the things collected are like shoes, tin foils, plastic, and the water was really dirty. In one of the tributaries, actually, in the Mathare River tributary, we had unusual amounts of lead. And when you think about it, kids live around this, people use this water, or in one way or another, it gets to them. And to have a lot of lead in such a populated location, because that's an area of the city that's really populated, it's quite shocking. For me, I found it really shocking that we can have a whole tributary with such amount of lead. I think the normal standard, I will confirm this, is maybe 12, but this Chibucha had like 68, I don't know the measurements they use of lead, so which is more than thrice or four times the actual capacity that needs to be there. But anyway, that's just like a side note. So here's the logic on even security matters. As the most populated, this is something maybe I can bring in from my criminology side. Also, the most populated automatically becomes the most affected. And this is also something that we are going to look into in regards to climate change. So the most populated cities, if floods come, they will be the most affected because it will be a lot of people in one region per capita. So it's just the definite ratio. Most people, most affected. This analogy on climate change is also quite what we see in informal settlements and many cities, particularly in developing countries, has limited planning and implementation capacities. This is something I think I borrowed from UNDP. And by the way, I will list all my sources for my statistics and whatever things I'm mentioning as facts. So urban planning and limited capacities when it comes to implementation of resources is something that we cannot, especially now that most cities have been built, we can't now start taking down skyscrapers to try and make room for more trees or more sequesters of carbon. So we have to work with what we have in terms of, remember what I said in the previous episode on adopting, just trying to live with it in a way that's sustainable. So on the effects of climate change on cities, so that you can see how to relate this with your own city as much as I relate it with my own city. Number one is displacement. We have floods, drought, this being called climate change migration, where we have, if an extreme weather pattern happens, most people try and relocate to different areas. By the way, yesterday, which is April the 23rd, we had flash floods in Mombasa. It's kind of crazy. So people now in those areas, you can see they'll need to move and find new locations to live in. So how does that affect your city? Displacement. The second one is infrastructure. Heavy rains and flooding, droughts, landslides, damaged roads and bridges, damages of power, water, and waste supply chains, transportation. So in regards to your city and climate change, which of these affect your city? By the way, I think a few weeks ago I was in the CBD, the Central Business District of Nairobi, and it rained so bad. It rained so bad that actually a tree fell and it blocked the road. So this is kind of the question I'm asking. How do these things affect your infrastructure when it comes to climate change? And water supplies, do they mix with the sewer lines? Do this cause diseases? Do transportation halt because the roads are impassable? Do you have trains that you can use instead when the transportation is blocked and stuff like that? This is something I think I'd like to engage with most of you, and you can tell me where you're located and the effect you have witnessed in your cities. So when it comes to health, this is also another correlation to climate change. Waterborne diseases that come with flooding, such as malaria, cholera, meningitis, and the pressures that this now cause to the health systems. So if in one region it floods and 90 of the 200 children there are affected by acute malaria, and this is something we see in our lakeside region of Kisumu, what happens to the health systems? Do we have 90 beds just waiting for 90 kids to get malaria? Or are there no even 10 beds for 10 people who are suffering from different diseases except malaria and waterborne diseases? So are the health systems in your country or in your city affected rapidly by climate change and its random effects? And the final thing that an effect of climate change on cities is food and water security. So does this happen when it has reduced or overly increased population, and the rain and the change in weather patterns affect the agricultural sector? And in urban areas, feeding the population. So what happens if the populace can't be fed? There's two sides. This is something funny, by the way. Last year in Uganda around the same time we were having such a difficult drought in Kenya. Uganda was suffering, quote unquote, the other side of the coin that comes with drought. So they were having extreme floods and landslides. So the food and distribution patterns was cut. And in Kenya, we had drought and no rain. So there was no food and water distribution, which is quite the conundrum that also comes with climate change. All the effects of climate change, they affect everyone almost in the same way, because how do you explain the extreme sides of the pendulum? Rain and huge floods and drought and no food still having the same effects on the people. So in terms of security, most people now are in the cities. And what happens to the outside of the cities where, where the food is produced and there's droughts or there's a lot of floods that the crops are destroyed, there's hailstones and the crops are destroyed in the field? Who is going to feed the population? And infrastructure, I think we've also touched on that a bit, damaged roads and buildings, going on and on. So which of these effects, as just listed, do climate change affect in your city or the cities you've been around? So the effects of climate change has an impact on both developing and developed countries, and maybe cities as well. The developed cities being, of course, the most vulnerable to the effects of climate change. The difference sometimes being about the terrain as well. We have coastal cities. We have a coastal line in Kenya, by the way. And when we talk about the rising sea levels and also on island countries like Madagascar and so on, it also depends on the terrain. So the difficulties of the people in the coastal area in terms of rising sea levels are not the same as the difficulties of the people in the mainland in Nairobi, where we have just, maybe drought and no rainfall at all. So the terrain of the impact also affects what boils down to the effects of climate change. Now that we have the facts and we have the so-called impacts of what climate change does, as usual, what now? Data. So as we measure all this and we question our industries, how then do we act from all this information? And data is something that's been coming up in the recent past on how to determine what to act in the future. And I think it's such a powerful tool when it comes to rewiring our cities. And now, in terms of urban planning, I will give you a quote. Fundamentally, good city planning practices are by the nature also climate change smart planning practices. And this is by the UN Habitat Planning for Climate Change 2014. So in simplified terms, this is something that maybe developing countries can also capitalize on. Before you just go out and start building industries and turning a desert area into a booming business and city, because that usually happens. If you start something, people will get attracted to the work there. So before you do all this, can you just stop and wait and think that if this turns out to a city, this is a plan we're going to take in terms of developing the waste sewer lines, in terms of not cutting down trees to build areas instead of just building around the trees. And this is something, by the way, I will have someone on come and talk about the greenwashing that's happening in cities where we cut down thousands of trees and then we build a whole skyscraper and then we come do some greenwashing of planting 10 trees outside just so that it looks a little bit green. That's called greenwashing, and we're going to call them out for this. So in terms of also urban planning, we have not building near coastal slopes or flooding areas. This is also into the developing countries which still have the opportunity to look into such matters. By the way, I think I saw a picture of Stockholm, and there is one picture where the buildings are so close to, it's like a river. I always wonder how that's going to play out in the next, 50 years. Will the water wash out, or what if a tsunami comes? It's just crazy. But if you have the opportunity, and this is to government heads and people who are in the decision-making tables of developing areas, think ahead before just going all out in relation to climate change. Storm and water management infrastructure. This prevents sewer lines from running with flood water. We have this crazy saying in Nairobi, and maybe I will be called out for this, but the drainage system in Nairobi during the rainy season is God's grace and evaporation. Honestly, we need change when it comes to stormwater. And we need people who are planning ahead when it comes to such seasons. We know in Nairobi we have the short rains or maybe the long rains around April. And so what are we doing the whole of before April to plan for how we will drain the water in the roads and not disrupt infrastructure? This goes back to the effects of climate change on cities. Protecting sensitive ecosystems within areas of the city. By the way, did you know that Nairobi is the only capital city in the world with a national park in it? It's also called the safari capital of the world, which is quite a privilege because we have a national park here. So in regards to this point of protecting sensitive ecosystems, we should not build areas that or interfere with ecosystems that are already present, because we had something like that when we were building our railway line, that the railway was passing inside the national park, and when they discovered that was going to disrupt the wildlife there, which is something I honestly thought they should have known, they decided to take the railway above, so it passes on top, almost on top sometimes, of the national park. And by that costs a lot of money. It cost like triple the money they should have used if the railway didn't pass in the national park. So this is about planning and future looking. So in the planning process, it's in 3 steps. What's planning? What is happening? What matters to join? And what can we do about it? That's just it. What is happening? For example, floods. What matters to join? How can the government, especially in terms of urban planning, can they do about this? And how will they do about it? And are we even doing it in the moment? All this sounds expensive, I know. And when you talk about developing countries, maybe some things are not so quite clear to them in terms of correct urban planning. So how do the funds to all this get to them? And this is something I think individuals can worry about as much as government heads and policymakers, urban planners should also worry about. We have small grants. We have budget reallocation, municipal bonds, etc. In budget reallocation, we can maybe the government needs to look into places where money is not so much needed for the future benefits and invest it in areas where it has long-term benefits. But that's now for policymakers and decision makers of the time to determine. That's now on them. I'm not going to stress myself. But listen, as I conclude, the battle against climate change will be fought in cities, and cities can be the problem, but cities also can be the solution. We need to check our greenhouse gas emissions and the air quality and the honesty that we have in, developing policies that keep this information and industries in check, because we can have bodies that are mandated to do this, but they're just like toothless watchdogs. And this is something maybe we'll talk about when it comes to policy. In my country, we have watertight policies, and this is something I was talking with my friend from Netherlands. For him, it's kind of the opposite. They don't have so much rigid or watertight policies, maybe just like slaps on the wrist. But in Kenya, we have such huge and really great policies, but on the ground, they're not quite followed. So maybe these are honest conversations that we need to check about when it comes to cities and climate change, because this is where it will be felt the most. Thank you again for taking this flight with me. This is doable and there is hope. See you on the next flight.